Hey, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of Let's Talk Cloud. We are coming to you live across three main platforms here. We are hitting up LinkedIn Live. We are on YouTube as well as Twitter. Hashtag is Let's Talk Cloud, as you can see from up at the top of the screen. We've got the we've got the team monitoring the chat across all three. So if you have questions or comments on the discussion as we're going along, please feel free to jump in. I can see already we got a ton of people live on the stream. We've got folks from Canada, from the States, from Mexico, from India, from Chile, tuning in from the EU, folks from all around, which is really, really awesome. This has been a really fun series. My name is Mark Nunakoven. I'm the Vice President of Cloud Research here at Trend Micro. And every week on Let's Talk Cloud, I get to talk to somebody exciting and interesting about stuff that they're doing in the cloud, about challenges they're facing, about issues they're dealing with. And this week, I have the privilege to speak with Madeline Vanderpelt. She is a rising star in the Trend Micro engineering and development ranks. Madeline, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Do you want to give us a little blurb about yourself?
Sure. I'm a software developer at Trend Micro, like Mark said. I work on a team who's working on Trend Micro Cloud 1, and we get to do all sorts of cool stuff with serverless, cloud architectures. It's really interesting stuff, yeah.
Awesome. Very, very cool. So for our discussion today and the title of the show, what I thought would be really interesting is to frame it around a new book that came out. And this book is called The Unicorn Project. It is part of a series you can see here on screen now that started back in 2013, if you can believe it or not, with a book called The Phoenix Project. And that was really what sort of solidified the DevOps movement, the merging of development and operations, followed up quickly by the Devops Handbook, Accelerate, and then finally the Unicorn Project. And the premise around the Unicorn Project is it's all about developer enablement, really about developer productivity. So who better to speak to than one of our top developers to find out the challenges and sort of the real side, the personal experiences. Because if you're not in development, you can read this book and go, okay, this seems pretty logical. Obviously, you know, it's written like the Phoenix Project as a novel, as opposed to like the Devops Handbook, where it's, you know, more academic, more structured problem. But this focus is really on developer productivity. So why don't you kick us off, Madeline? Give us an idea, like, what do you think the key to developer productivity is?
Oh, good question. I would say that the key to productivity as a developer is being encouraged and allowed to experiment and sort of deviate from, you know, the way you've always done things, and being allowed to try new methods, new architectures, new technologies, because that's really what enables you to find what's going to work for your product or your project, and enable you to go faster while doing those things.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. So one of the things that Gene Kim is the author of this book, as he was the primary author on the Phoenix Project. One of the things that Gene is fond of quoting lately, because, you know, being a key in that movement, he always gets asked, you know, what's the definition of DevOps, which is one of those questions where you just go like, oh, crap, like, okay. You know, and being the guy, I'm sure Gene's sick and tired of it. But one of the answers he gave in a talk recently around the book that we're discussing today was he liked this definition, which is better value, sooner, safer, and happier. Was the definition of DevOps, and that's from John Smart. And I think it's a really interesting one, you know, because it talks not about like give them better tools and do this. It's more of a principled goal. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think it's an ideology, not a prescription by any means. Enabling people to feel as though they can try to improve things is super important, right? That culture of like a learning culture, or where there's no fear of falling on your face. That's super important to enabling it. I would totally agree that it's not, you know, one size fits all solution. You have to figure out what works for your people, and go from there, and asking them what they need, as opposed to just providing them a bunch of tools and saying, hey, these things will make you go faster, is super important too.
Okay, so let's explore that a little bit, because I think that's interesting, because a lot of like maybe the not as connected, not as with it approach would be like, here's a set of tools, like here's our standards, here's how you should be developing, this is what you should be using, because this is what the team is using, right? We've standardized on the following things in our organization. Does that run counter to this idea?
I would say there's a time and a place for standardization. So within a team, for example, you don't want 5 developers working on the same code base using 5 different tools. But at the same time, what works for that team might be different from what works for a different team. So I would say standardization isn't necessarily counter to it, but you don't start with standardization, in my mind. You would start with exploring your options, experimenting, and then figuring out what works best for the situation that you're in. And then saying, okay, when we're in situations like this in the future, here's a set of tools that I know worked for me in the past. Maybe I can leverage them again. Or maybe there's new tools that have come out and I should explore some new things again.
Okay.
So I think it's sort of an iterative thing.
Yeah, and I think that seems to strike a balance between, ending up with a 20-year-old IDE that you're trying to make work, and also not going cutting edge nonstop, right? And actually just never, like I always look at the JavaScript world and go like, oh my God, like it's Tuesday. Let's create an entirely new framework and movement, right? Like it's overkill on that side. But do you find it, personally, do you find it challenging to strike that balance between sticking with what's working and exploring newer stuff that might be better?
Yeah, there's always a little bit of a challenge, partly because there's so much unknown and there's so much change, right? Every month there's a new tool. Every day there's a new tool. And whether that tool works for your purposes or you have the time or the need to actually explore it is something altogether, right? You might think it's really cool and might work for another project in the future, but it might not be worth interrupting your current setup that you have going for your current project. There's definitely a balance, and I'm one of those people who really likes exploring new technologies. So for me, it's sort of something I have to rein myself in on from time to time, where yeah,
you can get lost down that rabbit hole in a good way, personally, very, very easily, right? So do you actually account for that? Like, I know, working on sort of a more not traditional, but an agile methodology where you're planning out your sprints and you're accounting for sort of velocity and stuff. Do you account for that kind of like tooling exploration as part of that flow?
Yeah, actually, my team, I've been reading a lot of books lately, actually, and one of them was called Making Work Visible. And my team actually just switched to using Kanban instead of sprints. Okay. And as part of that, the reason we did that was because we found that there was a lot of work that wasn't being brought to our attention, that wasn't visible, and that people were doing sort of, it was taking up their working hours, and it should have been. It was learning and it was experimentation and things like that. So what we actually do on my team is when we get a new project, we'll actually create separate tasks for exploration and have a goal of, at the end of this, I want to know what my options are, what is the recommended approach, and then we go on to the task to actually do like the implementation of that feature, if it's like a really big feature. So we're really trying to sort of make it clear and make it easy to track that progress, and also it allows us to sort of track the things that we've tried and experimented with and tools that we've looked at, and then next time we can go back and look at those notes again as well.
Nice. And is that, so one of the things you said there I think is really, really important, was, work you're already doing, but making it visible, and that's what's prompted you to move over to the Kanban approach. Now, obviously, that's not sticky notes on a wall right now. Let's dive into the more technical implementation side for a second. What are you guys using to actually implement that Kanban approach right now?
So we do it through Jira. which is what we were using for sprints before that.
Yeah.
One crazy thing, though, was when we made that initial switch and I was setting up the Kanban board for my team, I noticed we had like 90 things in our backlog. And yeah, and we're a team of four developers. So I went through those with, project management, product management, everybody who needed to be involved. And I said, which ones of these are never going to be done?
Yeah.
Which ones provide no value to our customers, no value to our developers, right? Why are they all here? Do we still own all of these things, right? Because there were areas of the product that had been shifted to other teams over the last year, and the cases just hadn't been taken with them. So in a couple of days, we got it from like 90 things down to 40, which was like half pretty much.
Yep.
And then as we kept working on delivering our big sort of feature, we got it down even further, and now it's going back up again as we're doing more projects. But it's one of those things, it was really important, I think, to do, because it got rid of like this huge, it made all this technical debt that we had like really visible. All of a sudden it was like in your face every day. You open up this board and you had 90 things, and it was overwhelming. Whereas before we had, our backlog and then our sprints, and you pulled the stuff into your sprint and you kind of ignored what was on the backlog. And I found myself doing that, at least.
Yeah, and I think that's a key takeaway, especially for those people watching who aren't actively developing. A few things that kind of triggered in my brain when you're talking about that is that none of the work changed. It just, you finally saw it, right? It's not like this, all of a sudden you were like, oh, we're switching methodologies and we've created a backlog of 90 things. That backlog was sitting there, but somehow you guys were blissfully ignorant or willfully ignorant of it, as opposed to it sort of mentally weighing down on you nonstop, which is basically, the bad way of phrasing making work visible is so that you're like, that's really annoying me. I want to do something about it. And have you found, so how recent was this switch over to the Kanban approach?
It was probably the start of March, I think.
Okay.
It's about 2 months almost now.
Yeah, so a little bit. So have you found, a little bit into this, obviously crazy times and a different structure for the team, period. But have you found that this is you're able to feel that more by seeing it?
Yeah, we ran this as sort of an experiment with our team. So at the end of the first month, I followed up and I said, okay, what have you liked and not liked? Should we change how we're doing it a little bit? So we decided that it was a little bit harder to prioritize work because initially we had so many things on the backlog. It was harder to keep them in order of priority. So that was one thing that we didn't like. Whereas sprints, you can see, okay, we've clearly chosen these things to work on for this week or 2 weeks or however long your sprint is. However, we really did like the flexibility of it because at the end we were doing 1 week sprints because our team, the service that we were developing is very rapidly changing and growing. So at the end of 1 week, we were often finding that we'd have, a set of things that we're carrying over to our next sprint. And that was weighing on us. You don't feel satisfied, or at least that's kind of how we didn't feel satisfied because we didn't feel finished. And we'd have, our sort of sprint wrap up. And on that day, we'd be rushing to maybe get a couple last things in to just make ourselves feel better that we'd gotten it done. When in reality, it doesn't really matter if it was delivered on Friday afternoon or Monday morning, right? In the long run, especially for things that aren't, super time sensitive. So that sort of psychological aspect, if you will, was kind of like one of the big factors in us moving to Kanban. And since then, it's been I found it really easy to see exactly what's in progress. And I can tell if people aren't updating their tickets as well. And then I'm kind of like, okay, what are you working on? All right, let's move that. But also at the end of the week, we still have sort of like our demo. What we used to do is at the end of our sprints, we would have a demo and we'd talk about what we worked on, what problems we hit. If we had incidents, we'd talk about those and just sort of, make sure we shared all that knowledge that we'd gained through the week.
Yep.
So we still do that, and we still have like a weekly, not wrap up, but just a weekly meeting to see what we've been working on, sort of more like a check-in, and we demo new features that we built and things like that. And I think we come to those meetings more excited to show what we've completed, as
Good.
opposed to like feeling like we need to talk about, oh, well, this is going to carry over. And so I personally have really liked it. And I think that in itself just makes you more productive, because you're more excited about what you're doing. You're not worried about not meeting a very random target of Friday at 4 o'clock, right? Sort of arbitrary. We could have changed our sprints to finish on Monday, and you would always have something carrying over.
Yeah. And I mean, that's part of the challenge. You use that term, making work visible. And I think that's key, because even that backlog, was assumed from the rest of the teams of like, oh, you're on it, even though you're probably never, as you figured out, you're on half them, you're not on it. You're never going to be on it. And that feeling, I always find it interesting when people have deadlines, and, my career favorite pet peeve still has to be, get that to me by the end of the day. And it's like, well, are you working this evening? Well, no, then you don't need it by the end of the day then, because you're not doing anything with it by the end of the day. But it's that, you need a deadline at some point, but make it make it productive, make it that, that feeling that you expressed, I think is absolutely critical. And I think this is probably a great time for me to actually pull up the graphic from the Unicorn project. Gene has broken developer productivity down into basically 5 ideals. So, locality and simplicity, focus, flow, and joy, which you've already mentioned a bunch, improvement of daily work, psychological safety, which a lot of people don't think necessarily would come up, and then customer focus. And, it just, even in the first little bit of our discussion here, you've covered on areas where, each of these are under different areas of the ideals. But I thought it might be good to frame some questions under each of these ideals, just for the audience to explore these concepts a little bit more, because I think there's, especially for people who aren't in development, who aren't working with teams who are building out technologies and services, I think there's a complete misunderstanding of sort of the challenges there, because it's very creative work. It's very mentally, challenging work, which is what draws, I think, a lot of us to it. But if you're going to spend 90% of your time doing grunt work and plumbing and managing backlogs and all that kind of stuff, like that's not an enjoyable day, let alone going to put you in a position to create what you need to create and to move things forward, right? So let's start with that first ideal. That first ideal, is around locality and simplicity. In the context of the book, that's really about making sure that developers don't have to go from team to team to team to set things up. So the heroine of the book, Maxine, transfers over, and she has this baffling, if I hadn't seen it a million times, experience of getting a developer environment up and running. She's got to talk to multiple teams. She's got to get credentials from people. She's pulling together, a multitude of half-written, if that, documentation. What has been your experience? So you've been with Trend for a couple of years now, so it's not like you've been setting up development environments, but I know, being one of the leads within the organization, you're definitely trusted to help bring new people on board. So just from your own reference, you don't have to get into the nitty gritty or call anybody out, but what do you think that's a real problem for developers is to getting up and running? And what do you think the impact of that is?
Absolutely. I would say it's a problem. And at any organization, even if you're not IT or developers, there's always a learning curve. But I think in development, getting an environment up and running, it took me 3 days when I first joined Trend.
Okay.
And I didn't know any better, but people were saying, oh, this is so much better. This is so much better than it used to be. Oh, it took me a week, right? And I was going, wow, you were this frustrated for a week? Like, that stinks. I think that getting your environment set up should be one of the simplest things to do, because everybody should have the same environment. It should be reproducible. It should be working. You should just have all the tools that you've needed in the past. Maybe not all the tools you need, because there might be new ones, but Docker is a fantastic tool for that sort of thing, right? Having an environment that is reproducible, that you can take from computer to computer. But that's not always possible, right, for every environment.
Yep.
I would say with some of the newer projects I've been on, so that would have been 3 years ago. With some of the newer projects that I've been on, we are sort of defining what our environment is because we're using different tools, different IDEs. And as we go, we're documenting that so that when we have new people join our team, that we can say, okay, here's a wiki, just go and follow these steps. And hopefully you should be up and running. If you have any questions, post them in our Slack channel, right?
Yep.
And there's always questions. There's always things that you can improve. And every time a new person gets set up, they have new things that you've missed, right? So we really encourage our new hires, our interns, to edit that documentation, add to it. Anything you find that you didn't know you needed, put it in there so the next person knows. So again, it's one of those things that we keep really iterative and like it's always changing, right? And your environment's always changing because you have new needs. So there's always new tools as well. But in an ideal world, you could come in and you could start up your computer and you'd just have to download some environment and you'd be up and running in, minutes, not days or weeks. That would be wonderful, but it takes time to get there. And I know that a lot of people are in different places in that process, but
very diplomatic of you. Very diplomatic.
Well, I mean, even within our own company, different teams are in different places with that. And
for sure,
I think that if a developer could come and sit down at their desk on day one, open up an environment and make, a small change and push it to production on their first day, that would be so rewarding, right? Instead of, being 3 months down the road and you're finally making your first change in production. To me, it's so much more satisfying and gratifying, and you're getting excited about your new job, right? Or your new team or your new project. And yeah, I think that'd be fantastic if one day everybody was just at that point.
And I hear you, and it's interesting because there's a couple things. So for those folks who are on more of the business side, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that when you started and it took you 3 days to get up and running, that you were paid for those 3 days.
Yep.
And there was an expectation from a resource side that it's like, oh, we have Madeline starting on Monday. Like we've got, that team is stronger right out of the gate. Yet, you were told by people around you like, oh, you're up in record time in 3 days. That's so much better. And that's not even to the point where you're learning the code base and the challenges and that's literally just to get into the environment to start that learning. And yet, it's a huge thing around developer productivity. So knowing that, because I don't think you're going to meet a developer who's going to argue that point that it should be just, run one script and you're up and running. Why don't, because I've yet to meet, I think I've maybe stumbled across a handful of organizations that have that in place. And normally they're really small and they had someone who was super vigilant from day one of making sure that wiki page was actually a script and it always worked no matter what. So given that it's so important, and that I think your point about feeling good about coming in, doing something right out of the gate day one, making even if it's just a small tiny change, but to be able to come home from work that first day and say, hey, I deployed code today to production. I'm already helping customers. That's such a huge psychological plus. What do you think? Why do you think teams then don't spend the time to build that out? Because it shouldn't be that hard to build it out and keep it maintained.
Yeah, I think because a lot of people didn't do it up front, now it's essentially technical debt, right? And with a lot of companies, technical debt isn't even on the radar. And the ones that it is, they're starting to try and make more time for technical debt and paying that off. But it's sort of, at least within what I've seen, it's just sort of being talked about more now. As something that companies have, and they're starting to acknowledge that they have technical debt. And so it's one thing to acknowledge it, but it's another to give teams the time to do it. And with there's lots of companies who are like, oh yeah, we need to pay down our technical debt. We need to deliver all these features. But when it comes down to it, a lot of the times they'll prioritize, that new feature that the customer is asking for versus technical debt. And even though that technical debt might speed up their developer productivity so that they can actually get features in the future out, faster. And that's one of my kind of pet peeves, I have to say. My team actually, we ran what we call debt days.
Okay.
I guess it was 2 weeks ago, maybe. So think of your typical sort of hackathon. So we at Trend, we have hack days, at least in the Ottawa office. We have hack days every 6 months, I would say. And you're encouraged to just try a new technology. It doesn't even have to be related to your daily work. A lot of times it is. But people play with sensors and they do all sorts of things that wouldn't be normal for them. So this came from Accelerate. I think they called them Yak Days in Accelerate. Mm-hmm. And I read that and I was like, that would be cool. so we tried it, and it was just on our team. So the 4 of us, and we took 2 days, and I said, let's focus just on debt. I said, it doesn't have to be debt that's on our backlog. Anything that's slowing you down that you have been wanting to fix for the last forever, anything that you come across in your day-to-day work and you go, oh, I wish this was better, or I wish I didn't have to do this, or, and I said, let's just focus on that. Pick something that is meaningful to you. And we have 2 days, and we'll do a demo at the end of it and see where we get to. And it was fantastic. One of our developers, improved, they automated improved an automated process so that we don't have to, do as much manual work. One of our developers took telemetry and metrics and said, I wish these were better. And they just went and, made better dashboards and made better widgets and metrics. And I went to our backlog and I said, there's some things on here that have been here for 7 months and they've really been bothering me and they're super quick to do, but I never have the time to do them. Mm-hmm. I'm doing those. And so I closed out 3 tickets that, had just been sitting there and needed a little TLC. And so, yeah, it was really important. And we sort of kicked that initiative off and said, we're going to do this. We're going to see how it goes. But if it goes well, we're going to tell everybody about this. And so we did. We shared it more broadly within the company. And we said, hey, this worked really well for us. Maybe you should give it a try on your team, see what happens. And so we're trying to spread that from the ground up and just help people recognize, because one of the things that came out of it is we started looking at our day-to-day work more closely and going, oh, okay, this is technical debt. I didn't realize that. And now we're becoming more conscious about it. And my hope of this experiment is that, if we do this often enough, if we have these dedicated days often enough, number one, we'll get the technical debt down. Mm-hmm. But my goal isn't just to reduce technical debt. It's to help people recognize what is technical debt, what's weighing them down, and just do it. Don't, make a ticket, put it on the backlog and just do it. Or don't even bother. Just if it's something really simple, just fix it. Don't wait 6 months until you have another hack day to do it. I want to encourage people to do that more as part of their day-to-day work, which is sort of the, improvement of daily work that they talk about in the Unicorn Project and in so many other books. But it's truly like doing that and doing it every day will make you so much more productive and so much happier. If there's that one little task that you have to do every day, and you come in the morning, you're like, oh, okay, yep, have my daily reminder to go and check in on, automate it.
Yep.
Set yourself an alert. If something's actually going wrong, it'll let you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that's a really good point. I want to dive into that. I just want to take a second to remind the folks, we've got folks in from watching from Brazil, from Turkey, from Germany, from Iran. If you want to join the conversation, feel free to comment on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Twitter. The hashtag is Let's Talk Cloud. If you have questions for Madeline, please feel free. We've got Joy and Ingrid checking that to bring it into our attention, to include it in the discussion, share your experiences. But a couple things you said there I think are absolutely key. So, your basic theme here is try to get a habit of tidy as you go, as opposed to letting it all pile up. And I think everybody being isolated and living in close quarters for the last few weeks can very much take that to heart, that it's much easier to clean as you go than to let it pile up. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, and this is not in a confrontational way, so don't take this the wrong way, but because I just think I think it's absolutely fascinating, the problem. But so this debt that you're cleaning up, is it always visible? And B, do you have the development environment and sort of that developer onboarding? Is that part of that debt that you want to be cleaning up regularly?
Oh, that's a good idea. So the first question was, is it always visible? No, absolutely not. Okay. I would say 60 or more % of the time, it probably isn't.
Wow.
Which is why I wanted to help people recognize what technical debt truly is. And they actually had a really good quote from the Unicorn Project. And they said, technical debt is what you feel the next time you want to make a change. And that really sort of struck a chord with me. I think that's probably the best description I've ever heard of it. It's the thing that you come across while you're doing something else and you go, oh, I have to do this too.
Yeah.
It's the thing, that thing that kind of just like, you're not expecting it. And then you remember you have to, I think that in itself, being able to recognize that is how you make it visible. Because a lot of it isn't. And then once you recognize it and you can communicate that and make it visible, another piece of that is bringing it up to, the visibility up to your team lead or your manager or whoever it is so that you can get the time to work on those things. Because if they know that you have all these other priorities and you can explain to them, hey, you know what, this will actually speed up all those other projects if you give me the day or 2 days or week or whatever it is to work on this, then they can start to see the debt and they can start to understand, you know what, let's hold off from giving them this next thing and give them a month to tackle some of this. And that's kind of the layer that's missing a lot of the times too, is a project manager or somebody will look at your backlog and go, oh, wow, they actually don't have too much happening. And in reality, you have all of this technical debt that you are working on and you're super busy with, or you wish you could work on. And I think that's really important. What was your second question? Sorry.
Is the developer like onboarding, developer productivity stuff, is that visible and treated as technical debt? Because for that challenge, it's, you only get a new person on the team or a new person into the organization every so often. It's not a daily occurrence. So it's one of those things that sort of, you said debt is that thing that, the next time you want to do something, you have to do that first. And the analogy I had in my head there was people who don't fill up their vehicles when they're on the way empty, like on the way home, they go, no, I'll do it tomorrow before I go out. And inevitably you go to get the car the next day and you forget. And you're like, oh crap, I have to go to the gas station. Probably not the most relevant analogy in the current climate. But I was like, oh yeah, I know. That's always, or like empty the dishwasher or whatever, like, do it before you have to serve a meal. But developers, bringing them on board seems like very much one of those activities that's just rare enough to not be one of those things that's top of mind, but then when you get hit hard.
Yeah, and I don't think I've ever thought about it that way before. I feel enlightened. It definitely is one of those things that you don't do very often, and when you do have to do it, depending on the project and your resources, it can be very time consuming. Even just explaining to a new hire how your product works or what the project is in itself is something that, it takes time. And that's something that you sort of have to do yourself. You can't automate that. But setting up their environment, shouldn't shouldn't be time consuming. It should be one of those things that we can automate and that we can have a collective like resource essentially that we can just deploy, or a community sourced thing. We do that a lot with sort of like templates sometimes, where we can one team's explored a new technology, other teams are starting to adopt it. We'll create like some guidelines or a template and say, hey, here's some suggestions, feel free to change it, and feel free to contribute back to the template when you find new things that need to be fixed. I think I'm going to start thinking about it as technical debt, because
even just and even just the normal, like, hey, Mac OS updated and now you need to use this flag instead of this one, or there's an extra prompt, or that kind of stuff. Just even if nothing else changes, there's just normal churn that needs to be addressed that you wouldn't encounter until the next time you tried to onboard somebody.
Yeah, for sure.
And that brings up something else I wanted to tackle, because we've been kind of dancing around it, and again, for those of you in the audience, Ronnie, thanks for joining, Mohammed, Annie, Hernan, all these folks from around the world. If you guys have questions, please jump in on the chat on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter. Hashtag is Let's Talk Cloud. We like to keep these interactive as much as possible. But one of the things Madeline's been dancing around, and I want to get your opinion on this, is architecture. So one of the things in the Unicorn project that Gene covers, I thought quite gracefully, was that there's a definite tie between how your people are set up and how the architecture of your product ends up being. And normally that's a bad thing, in that you've got really centralized gatekeepers, and they match the structure of your teams, and that you can kind of look at the architecture and dictate out what the team is going to be. A couple weeks ago, we had Forrest Brazil on the show. He's an AWS serverless hero, does a bunch of stuff around architecture, and he had a great post on CI/CD pipelines. And he said, if you look at the pipeline, I can tell you the team structure. And I think that's very, very true. Now, a lot of the stuff you've described, you work in a small team, that collaborates obviously around with a bunch of other teams. But I also know, having, been at Trend for a long time, that, like the Cloud One platform you work on is a variety of services at different states of maturity with different decisions made under different constraints. And there's a lot of variety in there. And the architecture isn't necessarily what you would do if you sat down today in a green space and said, I'm solving all these problems, here I go. How do you find that, how do you find the linkage between teams and architecture? And does that challenge how you can take on work?
Yeah, definitely dependencies affect the way you do your work. When I first started at Trend, I was on a team where we had dedicated QA people. We had dedicated developers. The ops team was completely separate. So my job sort of ended where QA started. So I would, create the feature and I would test it to my ability, and then I would pass it over to somebody who was QA for a team, and they would do the actual testing. If they found problems, they'd pass it back to me, and around would go until it was approved, and then it would go to, you'd make your pull request, and then whoever would approve it, usually it was your manager, your team lead, and then that would go into the code base, but then we actually might not deploy for another few days or a week, or it would depend. And that sort of is very different from where my team is today. There are still teams like that. We're deploying daily though now instead of, every week, which definitely helps with all of that. But when my team was formed, we were sort of pulled out from this we're just a little team. We were two people and an intern, I think. So it was just a tiny little team. And
that sounds like the name of a podcast, by the way. 2 people and an intern.
Yeah. And we were sort of given a lot of freedom to decide how we wanted to tackle our project and how we wanted to, interact with other teams or not interact with them, and how we want to structure ourselves. But because we were 2 people and an intern, we didn't have that dedicated QA person, and we sort of took that out as a big opportunity to define what we wanted our team to work and look like. And that's actually when we started going into sort of serverless and different cloud native approaches. And through all of that, we kind of each carved out our own sort of space within the team, but we had somebody who was really good at CI/CD, and we had somebody who, started off just on starting a code base, getting our project off the ground. And we, within ourselves, collaborated because, we're sitting right next to each other, and we could do all of that, and we could whiteboard things. And then we became our own ops people, right? Once this was in production, we added metrics and things so that we could monitor our own service, and we didn't need an operations team. We were that operations team, and then we learned a lot of things along the way. It didn't go, perfectly, but we sort of allowed ourselves to try to wear all the different hats and limit sort of our dependencies on other teams and other services, and I think it was really interesting because we were almost in our own little bubble, and it was very different from what we had been doing, that I felt like I was learning. I haven't stopped learning since I came to Trend every single day, but good. I was learning at such a huge speed, all these new tools like CI/CD. I could build pipelines all of a sudden when, a month before that, I didn't understand what a pipeline was other than this magical thing that built your code. And so, it was just like, oh, and an hour later you have this thing. And we were like, man, I hate waiting an hour for our builds. So we sped that up, and we did, different things that we'd had sort of that fear of doing, or even that, I hate doing that thing because it means I have to do this other thing. And we took all of that pain and we turned it around, and we said, okay, how can we fix this now that we don't have somebody to go and ask all these questions to, and we don't have somebody who's going to go and fix it for us? What can we do? And we've grown that now. We're 4 full-time people, which is fantastic. But we've sort of taken that ideology with us into all of our new services, and even taken it further, and we've started automating, the setup for our pipelines. So not even just the pipeline itself. So now when other teams want to use sort of the deployment space that we're in, all they have to do is add one line, make a pull request, and their stuff will automatically start getting created. Like, that's really cool to me. And so different from that initial, make your changes and wait a week, hope that they get deployed on the next deployment. And I know that that side of things has also come a long way too. But I think we were sort of unique in that we were given the opportunity to form our team around our function. Whereas as a whole, most of the other teams were formed for a specific purpose, or before they had a specific purpose, like you mentioned.
So that ties in. So first of all, I think it didn't always go perfectly is a euphemism for some really big disasters. But that's part of that's how you learn, right? Exactly. When things blow up, you learn fast. But this comes back to one of the things that the Unicorn Project covers around the first ideal, which is around testing. And it says, ideally, you are able to test what you are building fully, and in a non-ideal, which I always think is super polite way of saying, this is horrible, we need to avoid it. But in a non-ideal way, you're locked into testing in these big integrated environments. It takes forever to set things up. There's a whole bunch of dependencies. So it sounds like with your team, you were given the freedom to sort of create that environment, to get away from that QA structure. And it's not that QA goes away, it's that everybody's doing QA. You're taking a different approach to it. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So on our team, if you haven't written a unit test for what you just wrote, you're not done yet. Or, some other sort of automated test. And I would say 90% of our tests are automated. There's not there's times when we do have to do, some manual exploratory testing, and I think you'll always have that. But it's not that QA goes away. It's more that they've become these experts that we go and ask advice, and we go and how would you approach testing this sort of scenario or situation or project? Because I don't know. I'm not a QA expert. I wasn't, I didn't come up through that stream of things. So for me, I've written tests that I think cover, all the edge cases, and I think I've, done a good job of it. But then to have somebody that I can go and ask for that extra, level of review and help, I think is really important. And yeah, I don't want to diminish QA in any way. I think their role has just sort of shifted from doing all of the testing themselves to enabling all of the testing and enabling teams to learn more about it as well.
So before we get bombarded on Slack by the QA people, I think what you're saying is very similar to, for a different reason though, what happens with UX and what happens with security is that in that case for UX and security, you have a limited amount of access to those people, and they can't do everything, right? Whereas QA, we used to hire almost one-to-one to build that up. But what you're talking about is removing the grunt work from QA and up-leveling them to where they really have the interesting stuff of the complicated nuance of how the larger stuff goes. Same with the UX people. They can't program every button and every piece of the UI or the, the onboarding experience or whatever, but they're there as a resource, right? They're there as, okay, what are you trying to accomplish? Let's help you go through that. And it's nice that QA has gone the same way, because that always was a crazy system. And this was well before your time. In the 90s, we used to structure that. If you look at Microsoft in the 90s, it was basically one-to-one, if not 2-to-1, like QA to normal to dev. And you're like, how does that make any sense to have an army of people who only test the army of other people's work? Like how are you moving forward at the speed given the amount of people? So it's good to hear. And that directly aligns with, developer productivity and joy and flow. This is, we're doing great here. We've only really I figured I'd structure this all, but I think, we're covering in an organic way across these 5 ideals. I want to bring them up on screen again, just to remind people, because we have touched on, the locality is really that testing thing. Can Madeline and her team test everything as opposed to going out to other areas? Automation really speaks to simplicity. The focus and the flow and the joy is really underlying all this. Same with that improvement of daily work. There are some other areas I want to dive into more, but what I wanted to do is take a quick pause here and go to a segment that we do normally on this show just for fun. We call it rapid fire. And what I'll do is I'll just fire off a few questions, and you have to pick one of the other answers with no explanations.
Okay.
And then we'll go back and dive into them a little bit more. Because it's just fun, and you're not going to get in trouble. Maybe a little bit, not more so than that QA comment, because I guarantee you Slack's blowing right now. So programming model, functional or object oriented? Which one's better?
Functional.
Okay. Immutable infrastructure, is that a real thing or just a pipe dream?
Both.
I love the amount of questioning in that answer.
Well, I'll go with pipe dream then, more than it is real.
Okay, we'll come back to that one. YAML, begrudgingly useful or the bane of everything in space and time?
Useful.
Okay, you can tell my opinion on YAML just the way I phrased that. This one I was really curious. Code repos, the mega repo or individual repos for every component?
Individual.
Okay. And then microservices, lifesaver or ticking time bomb?
Again, I want to say both. I'm going to go with lifesaver for now.
Okay, let's circle back into these, because these were, one of the fun parts about this is I think in my head, oh, it's just going to say this, 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 and this. And then completely different things come out. So you were pretty solid on functional for programming. Why? I'm curious.
I've been able to explore that a little bit more lately. Everything they teach you in school, everything you sort of start off with was object-oriented. Or at least that was my experience. And it made a lot of sense because you had this object, you were doing this thing to it. changed it in this way. But functional programming opens up a lot of other doors, and you see it a lot more in sort of lambdas and things like that as well. And I think that's what I've been dealing with more lately. And I've seen the bright side of it as well. Whereas object oriented, you have to pass around things, and there's sometimes that like, oh, did I actually pass in am I modifying the original one, or did I mess it up? Threading, it just, there's a lot of kind of room for unknown things to happen or unexpected things to happen that you didn't mean to do. That
complexity adds up quick, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So for immutable infrastructure, you wanted to say both instead of real or pipe dream. So given that you're now with your team, you're responsible for a lot more, right? Like you're doing a lot of the operations, you're standing up your own stuff. What was your thought there? Because I noticed the wheels started turning hard on that one.
I would say that, you want to have infrastructure that stands up, that does what you need it to do, that always works. But that isn't the reality, because if you make one little change to how you deploy it, or how do you, you hit the wrong button, like you tweak the wrong setting, you can change it. The way I like to approach it is actually setting up infrastructure as code. So it's less intentional, it's more intentional when you make a change, and less, it's harder to actually do something by accident. And, when you make that change and it's a pull request and somebody else has to say, oh yeah, that's a good idea, or hang on a second, what are you doing? It sort of helps you get to that pipe dream. And I think that we're not there yet, but I think it's not that it's inconceivable. Like, I think you could get there.
Fair, because that's a big shift, right? Like same with functional from object, is that for the last 30 years, we've taught people object-oriented programming is the primary way. And, it's not always the best way, because those abstractions start to break down on the edges. Same with that kind of like, okay, we've had infrastructure that's always been live and you need to care and feed it and keep it going. Going to immutable is just a big like, okay, now we're doing this a completely different way. And that ties to that last one where you kind of had that hiccup on microservices. Whether it was a lifesaver or a ticking time bomb, it seemed like you might have had a tiny bit of an opinion on that one.
Yeah. So I started off with this project or product that's sort of built around this monolith of code, and you've got all these intertwined things, and it's I don't know anybody who understands the whole system, which scares me.
Yep.
Right? Yep. Because we each understand our components and our pieces of it, but we don't understand when something goes wrong. Sometimes you have no idea if it was your thing or it's somebody else's, or, something way over there that you didn't even know was related. And I think breaking things into microservices, it's very easy to validate exactly what your service is doing. It's very easy to wrap your head around something that's, 500 lines of code versus 5 billion lines of code, right? And, as well, like you can use contract testing and different things so that other services know if what they're about to do is going to break your service, and vice versa. And that enables so much more. And it just, that understanding is so much clearer. And I think that helps so much. But at the same time, like, who knows 10 years from now if this is all going to, we'll find a new thing and we'll be like, oh, microservices. Like, I think they're the new thing, and everybody's really excited about them. And I think they make a lot of sense in the moment, and compared to that monolith. But I think there's also sort of the desire and the, like, people see them as this really cool, really like awesome thing. And they almost make too many microservices, in which case you have that ticking time bomb where you're like, so there's sort of like a balance that you need to strike. And
Yeah, I think what you're getting at there is, finding that decomposition line is really important because, and I've seen it, it's same with containers where people go, oh my God, this is going to solve all of our problems. And you're like, what? Nothing ever solves all your problems.
Yeah.
But they very quickly go from, or not very quickly, but over the course of 6 to 9 months, they go from having a monolith problem to, that they don't understand, to 300 microservices that they don't understand the interactions between. And it's like you took the same problem and just distributed it, right? Like there was you didn't actually get it. The idea was to break the monolith into functional pieces that make sense for your team and your logical model of what you're building, not just, you get a microservice. You don't want to Oprah the microservices where everyone gets a microservice. And, you're like, oh, you've got 10 lines of code. That's a microservice now. And you're like, what? So I get it. I think that's totally, totally logical. So let me, we've gone all over the map on this in a really good way. I think it's been a really dynamic conversation. We didn't need to kind of structure going pillar by pillar, but there was a couple overall questions as we're wrapping up here that I wanted to ask you and get your opinion on, because I think, you get really unique perspective. You've been in, you've seen a lot of transformation in a short amount of time, which is not everybody's experience. And I think, that perspective is really valuable for the audience and obviously for yourself and your teammates. But having read the Unicorn book, or at least the crib notes, you never know, there's lots on the thing, but I'll assume you've read the book. The Unicorn Project, very much like the Phoenix Project, is a very different kind of tech book. What was your thought of the presentation, through like that story, that novel form? Did it work for you? Did it not work for you? What did you think?
So my first introduction to tech books was the Devops Handbook.
Okay.
Which objectively has some very good ideas. Mm-hmm. However, I thought it could have been, like a third of the size that it was. Personally, I wasn't into the do this and you shall receive these benefits. Like it was so prescriptive, I found. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I found that the case studies and that stuff really interesting, but to me, it was too much. Whereas the Unicorn Project, I actually wanted to read it. It was one of those books I started and I was like, oh, I'm into this. There's a story. And I think I didn't know that sort of tech book existed. I thought they were all this sort of prescriptive, natured book. But there's a lot of them that are more, story-esque. Turn the Ship Around is another good example. Mm-hmm. And I personally relate to that so much more because I don't want somebody to tell me, do these things and they will work for you too, because they might not. I want somebody to say, hey, we had this situation and this is what we did. And I actually found myself frustrated reading the Unicorn Project because I was frustrated for Maxine because I could see exactly where they were taking these things and I was like, oh, that would suck. Or I got really into her character and I could feel her pain, as opposed to the Devops Handbook where it was more, do these things. I really liked it.
Yeah, that's really interesting because the Devops Handbook is more of a reference book. Without an easy way to access it. Now, there's a ton of great stuff in there, but it's written like a book that you're going to read start to finish, even though it's designed as a book that you should just pop in and out of, which is, I think, the frustration, because it kind of sits in the middle. It's a book that's really talking about cultural change, but it's written like a book on, on Scala or Clojure or something like that, where you're like, okay, cool. Like this is how you create a variable. And this is like, it walks you through the process, which is the traditional tech book way. But yeah, I agree. The first time, like when I read the Phoenix Project when it came out, and then the Unicorn Project, when it was released, same thing. Like you empathize with the character, you understand the cultural impacts. And yeah, unfortunately, there are not many tech books that are written that way. And I think that's a problem because it does exclude a lot of people who prefer to get that communicated that way.
Yeah. And I think, both kind of types of books and types of, literature have different audiences and different people that they speak to more. But I think a lot of people, if you can put yourself in that character's shoes and you can feel what they're feeling and you can understand what they're going through, it sort of sticks with you more than reading something that reminds you of a textbook. Like,
Yeah.
I was never one for reading textbooks. I fall asleep. Whereas like the Unicorn Project, I actively was like, oh, just one more chapter. Like,
Yeah.
I
Nice.
actually was like, invested in it. And I think that's much more memorable. And when you're trying to instill these values in people and help them understand the importance of doing, daily improvement and different things like that, like being able to feel it as you go through can have a huge impact on people.
Yeah, I think so. And Laura, thank you for that positive comment on LinkedIn. I think I'm waiting in dread for like the security version, which will be like the Grumpy Bastard project or something, where it's just like nonstop screaming through the whole book, and then somebody at the end just crying for like 6 chapters. But I agree. It's when you can empathize, and I think that was I remember when I read the Phoenix Project, walking through just going like, duh. Like, of course. Like, why isn't it that way? Oh my God, what are you guys doing? And I enjoyed it, but I was so frustrated for the main character. And I felt that for Maxine as well, in the Unicorn Project, more with a like, oh God, I know what's coming next. Like here it is, the person playing political games in the background for no reason other than her own ego. And you're like,
yeah. I literally got like notes in there that were saying like, why does she think this is helpful? Like, I had one where it's just like, no. Like, I just had, but then I also had my, like, because that's sort of how I read these books, is I put little sticky notes in them as I go. But I had so many, when I went to review them, I had so many that were just like, why? Like, no.
Yeah, and that's a sign of a good book, right? And I don't think it's rare that you're talking about a tech book or a tech culture book in the way you would be talking about the latest best-selling novel. And I think that's a testament to Gene and the crew who put these together. So let me ask you a different question, a little more personal on this side. So you're at the start of what is bound to be a very long and productive and hopefully fun career. But even in that time, so let's reference back to school, where you were. First of all, what did you take for undergrad?
Computer engineering.
Okay, so right in the wheelhouse here. What you were taught there versus what you saw when you first came into the workplace versus what you have enabled and helped create for change. What has been your experience, seeing that difference in developer productivity?
Yeah, okay. In school, it's a very different culture and a very different, vibe. You're under really tight deadlines, which have zero give because the profs don't care whether you get it in or not. You either get the marks or you don't. And you're also under that pressure to, get it right the first time. And in the real world, like, that never happens. Very rarely do you get it right the first time. You have to, iterate and improve and add to it over time. But you're given exams where you have to code on paper. And you're like, how is anybody successful at this? And then you go and you're looking for a job and you have interviews where they make you, code on a whiteboard. And I don't know how many times I looked at the person and I was just like one asked me to code a cache, like design and code a cache on a whiteboard. And I was like, you go ahead and do it. Like, I don't know how to do that. And it's one of those moments where you're, and as the interviewee, you're standing there going like, wait, what? Like, how does anybody prepare for that question? Right? You're like, I know what a cache is. I can tell you how they work and I can design, tell you what to optimize for, and I can help you do that. But to actually code one, like any regular developer would probably have to, ask different people questions, look things up. You have all these references in the real world that you don't in these sort of school and interview scenarios. And I think that has to be my biggest pet peeve about interviews, like technical interviews, is coding on a whiteboard. That's not the scenario. Put me at a desk, give me a computer, ask me to write you something, like gladly. Right? And actually, I did have that experience as well. And I have to tell you, it was like amazing, so much better. And it made me so much more encouraged to, choose that company if I was given the choice.
Yeah.
And so that experience is very different. And then culturally, like when you start working, I think different workplaces have obviously very different cultures. But at Trend, it was very much, they really value sort of your work-life balance. They don't want you taking home work at the end of the day. They don't want you, working 18 hours a day. So I personally was like, I suddenly have all this extra time on my hands because, your deadline is still your deadline, but as long as you can manage that within your regular schedule, which, you learn to do, it's very different from school. So, and then, I think it's, I found Trend that way. I know a lot of companies are, different. Startups have different vibes, other companies in general, but I think it's really important that you have that me time where you're not working and, you have time to spend with your families and you have time to do the things that recharge you so that you go back into your work on Monday and be ready to go again. And I would also say the one other thing I've noticed, just being sort of a woman in tech, is very different from being a man in tech. And so in my classes in university, it was 10% female.
Okay.
So the engineering faculty liked to say that they had, 18%, I think, when I started. And that was one of the highest in Ontario, which is sad, but true. And they're up to like 30% now, which is great. But when you actually break it down by discipline in engineering, it's very different across the board. There's a lot of women in chemical, mechanical engineering, civil engineering. There's still not very many that are going into computer and electrical engineering. So I was, one of like 10 girls. I could name all the girls because there were that few. And so you sort of have a different situation. And it's more, you just have to learn sort of how to work with that, right? And work in different groups and settings and things like that. But then when you come into the workplace, your employer might have 50-50, or they might have that same 10%. And you sort of have to adapt and adjust a little bit. And different companies have different cultures, obviously, as well. So being a woman in one company could, be a very, very different experience than at another. And I've been very fortunate that it's not, a big deal. At least it hasn't been like a big prevalent thing at Trend, even though we do have, I want to say probably around that 15%, 20% mark.
Yeah, for engineering, it's somewhere around there. It's around, I think it's closer to the 15 than the 20. Yeah,
so it's still like that same sort of ratio, but you can have that ratio and still make sure that people don't feel any different. So I've been very fortunate. I have come across people where, like in an interview, I was told, oh, you're not our typical candidate. And I went, oh, and they went, well, a typical candidate is usually a boy who's been coding since he was in grade 9. And I was like sitting there going, is this a trick question? I don't know how to respond to this. And it was, a man at a company who, a very experienced person. And you would think that that you would hope that doesn't really play into their decision anymore, but it does. And in some places. And so it's, culture can be, it's a weird thing. It can be totally different everywhere you go. And I like to think that you can always find the place that you fit. And if you feel like it isn't the right fit, maybe you can help change that culture, or maybe you can't. Maybe you come up with too much pushback, and then you have to find the place where you do fit. And So
would you consider that, getting that question, or that comment, oh, you're not our typical candidate, was that a warning flag for you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay. I in the moment, I was sitting there and I was like, are you testing me? Are you trying to see how I'm going to react to this? Or do you actually just believe that I'm a lesser candidate because I'm not your typical candidate, right? And so immediately I was like, yeah, I'm checked out of this interview. I don't really, I would have ended it there if I could have, right? Because I was just like, this, you know what, this is a huge red flag for me, and I don't really want to. And that might have been one person at that company, right? The rest of the company might have been totally different. But when you're being interviewed, you're also interviewing them to see if it's a good fit for you. And at that moment, I was like, I don't think so. I don't think this is going to work for me. And I think having that self-awareness to recognize that and to say, you know what, I would rather not have a computer engineering job than work where they make you feel as though you're lesser because of any, and it could be anything. It could be because you're a woman or race or sex or gender or any of these things. But it was such it came from left field too. Like we were in the middle of some other conversation, and then it just was like, yeah, you know, and it was this offhanded comment, and I was like, it just got me boiled up.
I can't sympathize. Obviously, I am, as you can tell, the majority problem. But you know, it's interesting because so you know, I have a young daughter. My partner, she's in genetics research, and she's faced similar throughout her entire career, being in you know, a very intensely male field. And I know at Trend, you know, our CEO and a lot of our senior leadership are female, but in the engineering ranks, we drop down to that sort of typical, we're a little above average ratio. And we, you know, we have efforts like Close the Gap, where we're sponsoring women in engineering, women in computer science programs and things like that. But I think, you know, your comment of like, it's, you know, our typical candidate starts at like 9 and I think the problem is, you know, it's prevalent, but it seems like everything we can do to encourage at an earlier age that equality generates better results.
Yeah, I'm actually, it's one of my big passions. I'm like really involved in that sort of work. So in university, I was part of RoboGals and the Women in Science and Engineering and different clubs, I guess they were that. And we actually did workshops for young girls. And I went and played with Lego robots with them and helped them, you know, learn and just have fun and just expose them to these sort of things that they might not normally get exposed to. And even now, I'm actually a brownie leader with the Girl Guides. And
nice.
And I actually, so I have my own unit, but I also go across the city, across Ottawa to other units, and I put on engineering workshops for them. So we do things like making slime and building structures and Rube Goldbergs and, you know, all these cool different things that they might not normally get exposed to, because it is so crucial that they just see what's out there. And if one girl from these activities goes, hey, you know what, that was really cool, I want to do it again. That's all I can hope for. Like, I just want them to know that they have that choice and that opportunity and be exposed to it and get to try it. And some of them might hate it, right? It's not for everybody. And I think the difference though is that, like, historically, sort of science and engineering and those sort of toys and things that like would help you develop that curiosity and those skills are really were marketed to young boys. And, you know, science camp, if you were a girl going to science camp, again, you were like one of a couple, right? But like helping people to make that more normal is so important, because then they grow up going, oh yeah, I've always done science. I've always liked science. And, you know, I didn't have that. I coded for the first time in first year university. So
really?
Yeah. And that was Robot C, because we had the little like Lego robots. And I was like, this is really cool. And that one course was all it took. And I was like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to give this a shot. So it's like, yeah, it's really, really important. And it's something I'm really passionate about. And we were going to even do some events at Trend, but they kind of, you know, got postponed due to COVID and everything else. But, you know, I'm still hoping that we can do that in the future once things kind of shift back to a sort of more normal Yeah.
we will make sure that happens.
Yeah, I'm excited.
And I'm encouraged by seeing. So my daughter through the years in grade school, they start teaching them Scratch, and I was encouraged in that they didn't sit down and go, okay, you're going to learn how to program. They gave them they had to find a social problem and then code a game that addressed or that helped educate people about that problem. So
Cool.
like homelessness or food shortages, so they were really doing like a social studies project, and they just happened to deliver it instead of in a paper. They were delivering it in a game, which, they were like, oh, they didn't even think that they were learning about functions and variables and all this kind of stuff. They were, and at the end of it, they had a big demo day where all the parents came through and we had to play their games and they explained all this stuff. And I stepped back and went like, this is how it should be. Yeah. It's just another tool. It's exciting. It's great. It leads to an awesome career path. But there's no, I'm always reminded of and my age will show, of the Lego ads in the 70s and the 80s, where it was just about, they had, it didn't matter, it was just about bricks and building stuff. And then at a certain point, Lego got semi-gendered, which was ridiculous, in that, they were targeting it towards boys and versus girls, versus this is just something that you can express your creativity with. And it's nice to see that coming back. So you mentioned, you're doing work with the Brownies, which is amazing. I used to be a Beaver leader myself. I know how rewarding that work can be. And hopefully you're working towards a badge for them, getting the engineering badges and computer badges. Are there any other groups? Because one of the things we do with the show is we put all the, for the audience at home, all the stuff that we've talked about, so all the books, all that kind of thing, we put up in the show notes and the links so that people can easily reference. I'll put up the stuff for Trends Close the Gap, Girls in Tech, Women, all the organizations that we're associated with. But is there anything else that you'd like to put out a pitch for, or just raise awareness for while we're on the line?
There's a whole ton of really awesome resources, and they would depend, we have people from all over the world. So I would really encourage people, if they're looking to get involved in this sort of stuff, or for their daughters or nieces or whoever, even for their sons, like for everybody, reach out to your local universities. Most universities have some sort of engineering summer camps or engineering day camps. The University of Ottawa and Carleton do some like that. They actually have a day dedicated for Girl Guides. So we brought our brownies and it was lots of fun, and we got to, I don't know if it was Scratch, but they coded with something and they did different experiments and learned about structures and different things like that. There's a lot of really good resources online if you just want to try something. Just honestly just search it up, because everything's out there. And I would say there's RoboGals. They do a really cool workshops, and normally those chapters align with universities as well. And they're global. There's the Codemobile in Canada. I think it goes across Canada. I might be mistaken. It might be Ontario. And they'll actually come to your school or your youth group, and they'll put on like a whole workshop for them for the night. There's a whole bunch of different organizations, but I would say the easiest place to find information is usually your rec centers, your universities, colleges, anything that's sort of local to you. Yeah.
Perfect. And no better time than, especially for the kids now, when we're all stuck and isolated looking for things to do. Also, it's not just for kids. At any age, you can start programming. You can start to get into this stuff, because I think there is a massive amount of free resources out there, lots of great expertise, and a great community to dive in. So we had Tanya Janka on 2 weeks ago. She's a security expert in AppSec. She's a teacher, coach, used to travel around the world. Now she's doing a lot of it virtually because of the pandemic. But she does on Twitter Cyber Mentoring Monday, where just will help a lot of match people with mentors to help them break into the community specific to cybersecurity, but they're similar for development, right? So tons of resources out there. With that, Madeline, I want to thank you very, very much for this. This is a fantastic discussion, great perspective, great references, very much appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Perfect. And thank you everyone for tuning in. You can hit us up in the comments. Let's Talk Cloud. We will be back soon enough. Trendtalks.fyi for updates. Very soon, our new show, Let's Talk Security, is going to be kicking off, starring Rick Ferguson. And I say starring because if you've seen any of Rick's work, you know exactly what I mean. So please stay tuned for that. Thank you very, very much. We'll catch you on the flip side.